Okay. So again, welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Immigrant Rights, a live webinar with our presenter Irene with the PAIR Project. Okay, turning it over to Irene. Thanks so much, Irene.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess. So as Jess said, you guys can type in questions in the chat box, and because we have a small group today, I'd be happy to have questions come in while I'm doing the slides. Immigration, as I'm sure everybody knows, is very complicated, and there's a lot of different topics I'm going to be covering in the next hour. I'm going to go over, you'll see from the slides that there's a lot of material on some of the slides. I'm going to go over some of them fairly lightly, but don't hesitate to type in a question at any time, and I'll do my best to respond as I see the questions. So for today, I'm going to cover some of the recent developments in immigration. We hear about it in the news all the time. It's hard to make sense of what's going on. I do immigration work now every day of my life, and I still have a hard time following what's in the news. We're going to talk about what rights immigrants have in case they have ICE come knocking on their door, or they get stopped at a traffic stop, or they're subject to a workplace raid. We're going to talk about how immigrants can prepare themselves and their families in the event that they're not documented and they are concerned about being picked up and put in detention. We're going to also talk about the court process a little bit, what happens when somebody finds himself in detention or subject to removal proceedings in the immigration courts. And then we're going to close the hour with advice or information on where immigrants can go for help. As I said, there is a lot of information on the slides, and so after the webinar is over, you'll get a copy of the slides distributed to you, I think with some other information. So feel free to take notes, but do know that you'll get a copy of these slides if you'd like them. So the first point I'd like to make is that only US citizens cannot be deported. Anybody with a green card or any other kind of immigration status, and obviously people without any status at all, are subject to deportation. So someone is only safe if they are a US citizen. And what we see these days is a lot of people with green cards who thought they were safe being picked up and running into trouble. So let's start with the executive orders that President Trump started issuing soon after he was inaugurated. Everybody's heard about the wall. He wants to build a wall between Mexico and the US. He released a lot of funding to provide more border police. With the southern border, there are many more ICE officers. ICE stands for the Immigration Customs Enforcement Division. It's under the Department of Homeland Security. So you'll hear me refer to ICE a fair amount, and basically ICE are the immigration police that go out and enforce the immigration laws. They are present along our borders. They're present throughout the United States. They are actively picking up people who are not documented or have found themselves in the crosshairs of the immigration courts for various reasons that we'll talk about. So, and they also coordinate with police in various states and municipalities to the extent that those municipalities are willing to cooperate with ICE. You hear a lot about sanctuary cities. That essentially means that there is less cooperation between the city and ICE, and there's more protections for immigrants. Unfortunately, being a sanctuary city doesn't provide a lot of protections. People can still be picked up by ICE, even though they live in a place that, like Massachusetts, where there are more sanctuary cities. So everybody knows about the travel ban. There have been various variations of the travel ban. The current travel ban was issued September 24th. It focuses on people from Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Chad, and North Korea. Those people are not allowed to come into the US. People from the government of Venezuela and their families are not allowed into the US. These rules do not apply to green card holders or people with visas until their visas expire. The travel ban has been, the old versions of the travel ban were subject to litigation in the courts, and the same is true of the current travel ban. However, the Supreme Court has allowed the current version of the travel ban to be implemented, even though it is being challenged in the courts, and eventually the Supreme Court will rule on the legality of the ban, but it is currently in effect. So the advice that is being given to people who want to travel to or from any of these countries is talk to a lawyer before going anywhere. If you know somebody who is from Syria, Yemen, or any of these countries who's currently in the U.S., the general advice is do not leave the U.S. They may not be able to get back in. And this is obviously very difficult for people who want to leave. They might have a sick family member, a dying parent in their home country. And unfortunately, our advice generally is do not leave this country because it's too risky if you would like to come back. However, the better advice is that anybody who is subject to the travel ban should talk to a lawyer before traveling to find out how their circumstances might be impacted by the law. So DACA is in the news, obviously, every day these days. We don't know what the status of the program is going to be. DACA, for those who don't really understand it, and that's pretty much everybody, is a program started under President Obama to help young immigrants who were brought here by their parents when they were children. They had no control over the decision to come here. The only country they know for the most part is the United States. They've grown up here. They now work here. They are American in all respects except legally. They've never become U.S. citizens. DACA provided those individuals the opportunity to get work permits, and they were safe from deportation. They had to renew their status every 2 years. So anybody with DACA status has always been very aware of the fact that they were not here as citizens, and they have not had a pathway to citizenship. But they have been able to build their lives here and work. I heard on the news last night that something like 9,000 of DACA recipients alone are teachers in the school systems. We know President Trump has ended the DACA program, and the question for DACA recipients is how long are they going to be able to stay in this country? Are they going to be saved by a law from Congress, if Congress will pass a law? DACA recipients have been able to renew their status, but I have heard that some people are having trouble doing that. And I have heard stories also of DACA recipients now leaving the U.S. voluntarily because they don't believe they're going to be able to stay. What happens to people that have legal immigration status and their status disappears, as in the case of TPS, which we're about to talk about, is they find themselves here illegally all of a sudden, even though they've lived in this country for most of their lives. They are suddenly undocumented immigrants subject to being picked up, put in detention. We have seen DACA recipients in detention these days because they might have had some run-in with the law. They get picked up. They are not citizens. As you recall from the beginning, anybody who's not a citizen is subject to deportation if they run into trouble. And so more and more we are seeing people get picked up that we had not seen in the past, and DACA people that are DACA recipients are included in that. And it's fairly shocking because these people, as I said, are American in all respects except citizenship, but they are facing having to return to countries that they don't have connections to. So DACA is being litigated. The Trump administration's decision to end DACA is being litigated in the courts. So currently, DACA is being protected by the courts. We hope it will be protected by Congress. Anybody who would like to call their congressman and encourage them to pass the DREAM Act or save DACA should do so. So temporary protected status, TPS, is another program that has protected a lot of people, and it is now being ended by the Trump administration. So I'll give a very brief overview of TPS. What's happening now is because people that have had TPS status are facing losing it, many of them are asking questions about what's going to happen to them. So if you're out in the community and you hear somebody asking about TPS, I'll give you some information. You'll get these slides. Hopefully it will help if questions come up. At any rate, TPS refers to an immigration program that covers people from certain countries who were able to come here legally for a period of time. It was thought to be temporary because of something happening in their country that made their country unlivable. War, natural disasters, humanitarian crises have provided people opportunities to come to the U.S. Right now, there are people from 10 countries in the U.S. with TPS status, 325,000 people. You can see the countries on the screen. We'll go through them individually, some of them, not all of them. There are over 12,000 people in Massachusetts with TPS. The issue with TPS is it was meant to be temporary, but people have come here and lived here for many, many years now with TPS status. So people have had the opportunities to live here, have families here. There are many people with children here and jobs, and now they are faced with having to go back to their home countries again, where they do not have connections anymore. They don't have friends or family, and their children who are U.S. citizens are here. I'll say this probably again in a few minutes, but we've had a lot of questions from people who have TPS status, who are, for example, El Salvador. They're faced with losing it next year, and the question is, what do I do? I've got children here. Can I stay here? What they need to do is consult with a lawyer to be reviewed for other possible forms of relief. And later in this slide presentation, I'll talk about what those other possible forms of relief are. It's a bleak picture. No one should be optimistic or have their hopes up about this, unfortunately, but it is possible that somebody with TPS can try to transition to another status for different reasons. So just briefly, Haiti, the Haitian community, has benefited from TPS since the 2010 excuse me, earthquake. Massachusetts has about 5,000 Haitian TPS holders. 27,000 children have been born in the U.S. from parents with TPS. On November 20th, the Trump administration announced that it was terminating TPS as of July 22nd, 2019, for all Haitians living in the U.S. So for 60,000 people, as of July 22nd, 2019, they will no longer be able to live here legally. They are being faced with returning back to Haiti. Congress, again, could try to pass an immigration reform bill to help these people. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. The Salvadoran community is also being impacted by TPS. There was an earthquake in El Salvador in 2001 that was devastating. The U.S. government allowed thousands of Salvadorans to seek refuge here in the U.S. There are 4,200 U.S.-born children to Salvadoran parents under TPS in Massachusetts. TPS for Salvadorans is being ended. The Trump administration announced that on January 8th, 2018. So again, as of September 9th, 2019, Salvadorans with TPS will not be able to stay here and work here legally unless they find another form of immigration relief. The same for Nicaragua and Honduras. You can see from the slide, and I won't spend too much time on it, but you get the idea. People came up here from Nicaragua and Honduras based on earthquakes and a hurricane. They're losing all of these people can renew for a period of time, but the renewals will cease as of the last date offered by the program. So anybody with TPS should continue to renew for as long as they can, but at some point it will end for Hondurans. That will be May 2018, and Nicaragua, it's January 2019. There has been TPS for Sudanese individuals based on war. That's November 2nd, 2018 is the last date. South Sudan has been extended to May 2nd, 2019. There are likely to be more executive orders. The best way to check what's happening is to go to this website, and there is a lot of information that's provided at the masslegalhelp.org website. So we'll hear in the news, no doubt, when more immigration events happen. A lot of people have a lot of questions, and it's hard to answer them, but unfortunately, the answer is usually going to be check with a lawyer. And at the end of these slides, we'll talk about how people can get legal help. So, I'm sorry I'm going fast, but there's a lot of information. Yes?
Oh, this is Jess. Sorry, I'm just seeing in the question box somebody saying you continue to break in and out. I'm guessing that means the sound. So I'm not sure if everybody else can hear okay. In the chat box, if other folks are having a problem hearing, if you could just kind of type a quick note, like just yes, in the chat box if you're having trouble hearing, and otherwise we'll keep going, but hopefully you can hear okay.
Okay, I'll try. I mean, if it keeps happening to everybody, I'll try a different phone.
Okay.
We'll have to break for a moment.
I'm hearing you okay. It's a little soft, so I don't know if what can be done about that, but I can hear you okay. So
soft meaning not loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try talking louder. I feel like I'm shouting, actually. Okay, so what should people do when they meet an immigration officer? This is a big question. I mean, so we'll run through it. Everybody has constitutional rights in this country, whether they're here legally or illegally, documented, not documented. Everybody has constitutional rights. Everyone has the right to remain silent. That means not having to answer questions, not providing personal information, not providing fingerprints. Everyone has the right to see an arrest warrant. Everyone has the right to speak to a lawyer, and everyone has the right to make a phone call. This is something that every immigrant needs to understand. That is probably the single most biggest takeaway from our Know Your Rights presentations, is for people who feel incredibly vulnerable, because they are vulnerable, to know that they still can benefit from our Constitution in this country, even though they are not citizens. So what should someone do when they meet an immigration officer? It depends on their immigration status. If they have legal, lawful status, they may well want to provide their ID or their passport. If they are a U.S. citizen and or have legal status, I would recommend they simply show their card, show their ID. That should be, that, especially if they're a U.S. citizen, that should end the conversation. If they are a green card holder or have some other status and they show their card, that should also help them. It doesn't mean they are ultimately protected if they have done something, that gotten involved in a criminal activity, getting pulled over for some traffic stop. They can still be put into detention if they have engaged in some sort of criminal activity that triggers deportation. However, lawful status is much better than having no status, and so showing an ID is generally a good idea. If a person does not have immigration status and is completely vulnerable to being picked up by ICE, we generally advise that they not show their ID, that they not even have their ID with them, and that they stay quiet and not reveal information about themselves. So no one should lie. So if you talk to people in the community about what they should do, make sure they are honest, make sure they don't show fake papers, do not use an alias, a fake name. It is much better to say, I would like to be silent, than to lie. I have been in immigration court time and time again now and seen immigrants, people in detention, face the judge, and the judge have no patience when they discover that this is a person that used a fake name, a fake ID, false papers. That's a real problem, so people should not do that. What we do like to have immigrants use is a card. It's called a Know Your Rights card or a red card. If I were doing this presentation in person, I would hand out these cards. You can see a sample of one on the slide. They can be printed out from the internet. If you just search Know Your Rights card or red card, you can find them. They can just be printed out. It's simply a piece of paper that tells the immigration officer, as you can see on the bottom of the card, I want to remain silent. I want a lawyer if I'm detained, and I refuse to sign anything without the advice from an attorney. People should have them. Anyone who's undocumented should have a card like this in their pocket at home at all times. They can, if somebody knocks on the door, and we'll go through this in a slide in a minute, they can simply slide the card under the door. They don't need to talk to the ICE officer. They just give them the card. Or if they're at a traffic stop, hand over the card. They need to say nothing else. So in terms of traffic stops, we are seeing a fair amount of stops and activity along the northern border with Canada. More stops in New Hampshire in particular for our purposes here in Massachusetts. We have people in detention. I'm representing clients who were picked up trying to get to Canada because it is thought that Canada is better than the US for seeking asylum and getting immigration relief. That is actually not necessarily the case. And we have heard from Canadian officials saying, tell people don't come to Canada. It's not any better here. Nonetheless, I have a client right now who was misinformed. She's from Africa seeking asylum and was picked up trying to walk to the Canadian border outside of Burlington, Vermont, with all of her luggage. So they're on the lookout for people in Vermont and New Hampshire trying to get to Canada. So tell clients to be careful if they're in those states. So say you're at your house, you're an undocumented immigrant, and you hear a knock on the door. ICE comes knocking. What do? Everyone has the right do not open the door. And this is really hard because many people want to be polite. They may be afraid of ICE. They should be afraid of ICE, and they might feel like they have to open the door either to be polite or because they're scared. The best thing to do, if they are undocumented or they have family members who are undocumented or friends who are there who are undocumented, is don't open the door. Slide their card under the door or show it at a window. They can pick up the phone at that, right then and there, call someone who's a U.S. citizen to let them know what's happening. It'd be good if they have an immigration attorney nearby. ICE cannot come into the home unless there is a warrant, unless they have a valid warrant that is signed by a judge. I have some examples here. This is an example of a warrant signed by a judge. You can see at the bottom, signature of judge. There's a signature there. I've had immigrants say, well, how would I know? I can't speak English. How would I know if it's signed by a judge? That's a good question. It's hard. If you meet with immigrants directly, print out the slide, show them a warrant, and point out the bottom corner where it says signature of judge. If there is not a warrant, if ICE does not have a warrant, they are absolutely not allowed in the home. If they have a warrant that is blank, say they have a piece of paper that's typed, the spaces are filled in, but there are no signatures on the bottom, that's not a valid warrant, and therefore they should not be allowed in. So just tell people over and over again, they do not have to let ICE in unless they have a signed warrant, and they should not let them in. So here's an example that we use. There's a woman named Anna. She's undocumented. She hears a knock on the door. ICE says, we're looking for Maria. Anna says, I don't know Maria. Officers say, well, open the door. We want to see if Maria's there, or are you Maria? What should Anna do? Are they allowed to enter her home? The answer is no. They're not allowed to enter her home unless they have a warrant for Maria. And Anna's right is to not open the door. If Maria is not there and they have a warrant for Maria, she should also not open the door. She can say Maria is not here, or she can say nothing. There's a clip here from YouTube that I can't play right now, but when you get the slides, I highly recommend that you watch it. If you have the opportunity to coach people on how to say no to immigration officers, it's a very good sort of role play, dramatization of what happens when somebody comes to the door. It applies to everybody, even U.S. citizens. If the police knock on your door and they have no right to come in and no warrant, no one should let them in. Here's the warrant. This is another example. We do role plays with immigrants often, just so they feel confident in saying, if you don't have a warrant, I'm not opening the door. I have a client who is very polite. He's from a culture that is very, very polite to strangers. And so ICE came to his door and he invited them in and offered them tea and cookies, and was super nice because he's a very charming person. For him, it worked because he is so charming. He did not get into trouble. He's seeking asylum, and he had not yet filed his asylum application. He was not hauled off to detention at that moment. He was asked to appear at an office a few days later. I think he managed to charm the ICE officers. We were then able to call the ICE officers and say he's applying for asylum, and he got out of it. But generally, one should not be overly polite with ICE. It's very dangerous. If you are stopped while driving, now there are traffic stops, and we've talked about New Hampshire and Vermont. We know there are road stops in New Hampshire. There probably are some in Massachusetts. Just as with ICE coming to the door, if ICE stops you in the car or stops an immigrant, the immigrant does not need to respond. They can ask, am I under arrest? Maybe they're under arrest because of a traffic violation, and you can't unfortunately do anything about that if ICE has grounds to arrest you. But if they are not under arrest, the immigrant should say, am I free to leave? And if the answer is yes, they should say, I'm leaving, and they should leave. They do not need to cooperate unless they are under arrest. Even if they're under arrest, they don't need to cooperate necessarily, but if they are free to leave, they should do so. ICE has these little machines to take fingerprints of people. Just as with the right to remain silent, a person does not need to give fingerprints. It is the same as remaining silent. They can refuse to provide personal information. And so we advise people not to voluntarily give their fingerprints. Any information like that could be used against the person. That goes with showing, say they're undocumented, they have a passport with them from, who knows, El Salvador. If they show their Salvadoran passport, ICE will immediately know they're not a U.S. citizen, will know their status, and ICE can use that information. If they don't have it, they can't use it. And so we advise people not to, if they are undocumented, don't have legal status, not to walk around with a foreign passport or ID. At the same time, it is very important for people to stay calm. No one should resist arrest. They shouldn't run. They shouldn't fight. People need to try to remain calm and just not say anything. The workplace raid. So similar themes here with the workplace raid. Because everyone has the right to remain silent, they can do that in their place of employment. If they're asked to line up by immigration status, for example, U.S. citizens in this corner, TPS, legal, people with lawful status, green card holders in the other corner, and people without any kind of status in the third corner. Anybody without lawful status can refuse to move. They can stand silently where they are. They do not have to go into the corner and reveal themselves as having unlawful status. That is the same as forcing someone to speak when they have the right to remain silent. So every individual has the right not to communicate information about themselves, and that also applies to workplace inquiries. So I'm not going to dwell on this. It's the same thing. Miguel can refuse to give out his fingerprints. In terms of being prepared in advance in case someone does not have lawful status, it's very important these days to be prepared. ICE is hauling people in that would not have been hauled in 2 years ago. In the past, people have gotten into trouble when they've engaged in some sort of criminal activity. It could be drugs, domestic violence, traffic violations. Now we're seeing people in detention who do not have any kind of criminal background. They have not done anything noteworthy. They might have a minor, something very minor in their criminal record, but not the kind of thing that would have caused them problems in the past. But those are people that are in detention these days. We're also seeing more women in detention. We didn't see that before. When I started doing this type of work, you might have 3 or 4 women in detention. Now there's new people coming in every day, 18, 20, and they're people without criminal backgrounds. They're people with children. We've had women who have babies who are still nursing their babies. The babies were taken and put into foster care, and the woman was taken and put into detention. So these things are happening. It's real. They're happening every day. So people just need to be prepared. They should memorize important phone numbers, friends, family members, an attorney, preferably a U.S. citizen who can help them. They can put their documents, their foreign documents, somewhere locked up in a safe, make sure that someone they know that they're close to has access to them. We're going to talk about bond in a minute, but it's also good to have some money put away so they can pay a bond, which is the equivalent of bail if they do find themselves in detention. For children, many, many parents are in detention. Their children are in school. They're young. They are U.S. citizens. So the question is, how do you protect your children if you are going to find yourself? You're at risk of detention. People should have their children's birth certificates, important information gathered about themselves and kept in a safe place so they can be accessed if they are detained. Same with information about the child's school, who can pick up the child from school, who are the emergency contacts. If a child is born in the U.S., consider getting a U.S. passport to document the child's U.S. citizenship. One thing that's becoming sort of more popular, or popular is not quite the right word, but there are family preparedness kits that people can access. They can get them from the Mass Legal Help website that you see at the bottom. The preparedness kits have forms that can be filled out to give caregiver status or authorization to people to care for children. People can provide agent status. It's like a power of attorney, more or less. So if a person ends up in detention, they can they can have previously authorized somebody else that they are close to act for them. These kinds of steps seemed extreme in the past, but they're really not now. It's really advisable and important that everybody assume the worst will happen and then be prepared for it. Hopefully, the worst will not happen. But as I said, we're seeing all sorts of people in detention now, and there are people from all, all different statuses and circumstances. So what happens if somebody ends up in detention? In Massachusetts, we do not have separate ICE immigration detention centers. There are certain floors in certain county jails that have been cleared, and they're used for immigrants. Immigrants are not mixed in with the general jail population, but they are in the same building. They are in the same facility for the most part, but they are treated a little bit differently. They have a little more freedom, but it's not great. I go to the detention centers many times every week, and it's fairly bleak. The centers in Massachusetts, the jails that are holding detainees in Massachusetts are primarily Suffolk County in Boston, Plymouth, right off Route 3, and Bristol County, which is down in Dartmouth, the facilities in Dartmouth. Bristol actually has a separate building for some detainees, people with stronger, heavier criminal records, as immigrants end up in Bristol. Franklin County out in Western Mass has a jail there that they have immigrants, but the immigrants don't stay there too long. In my experience, they usually get transferred to Plymouth or to one of the other jails. So if somebody is arrested and they end up in detention, they're likely to be in one of those places. They can, also people that are picked up in Vermont and other New England states can end up in one of these jails as well. Family members can visit detainees, but if they have no status, they really should not do that because they are at risk of being picked up if they go to the jail or the detention center. Everybody who ends up in detention obviously wants to know how they can possibly get out, and bond is the first thing that anyone should be considered for. Bond is equivalent to bail. If somebody ends up in detention and they did not come from jail for a criminal conviction, so they were picked up at their home and they ended up directly in immigration detention, they are typically eligible for bond. In Massachusetts, if somebody gets picked up, is convicted of a crime, goes to jail for that crime, they often will go from that jail sentence to immigration detention. And if they are transitioned directly from jail for the criminal act to immigration detention, they are not eligible for bond. However, many people are eligible for bond. What they do is when they go to the judge the first time in immigration court, they ask for a bond hearing. And if they do not have a criminal record or they have a minimal criminal record, they have a very good chance of getting out on bond. Bond can range from $1,500 to $15,000. What a person needs to prove if they would like to get out on bond is that they are not a danger to the community. So that's where the criminal record comes in, and they are not a flight risk. If the judge is convinced that both of those factors are satisfied, the judge will set a bond, and the person then is released from detention, and they get on a slower track for their deportation proceedings. And during that time, they can live with family, get their affairs in order, hopefully consult a lawyer and find a way to resolve their immigration status favorably. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on bond, except to say that bond has to be paid in Burlington, Mass. So even if somebody's detained in Suffolk or Plymouth, a bond has to be paid in Burlington, and the detainee is then released in Burlington. That's just a logistical point if you end up having to advise somebody on bond. Once somebody is detained, they have the right, hopefully, to see an immigration judge, except in a couple of circumstances. If they have already been ordered deported, say they had a deportation order 10 years ago, they managed to stay under the radar and not get picked up. And then they are picked up because they were charged with domestic violence, for example. They are likely not going to see a judge. They're simply going to be deported. Anybody who's been in the country for less than 2 years can be subjected to expedited removal and may not have the right to see a judge. However, most people, unless they have a removal order, do see a judge. The first time they'll see a judge, they'll be sitting in the detention center on video conference. They should ask the judge, if they don't have a lawyer, they should ask the judge for more time to get a lawyer. Usually judges do provide time for immigrants in detention to get a lawyer. They might give them a month, they might give them a week, but anyone who is not prepared, doesn't have a lawyer yet, and has to face the judge should simply ask for more time. Not everybody ends up in detention. Some people are picked up by ICE and asked to, they're put under what's called an order of supervision, which means they don't have to go into jail and sit in detention, but they might have an ankle bracelet put on their ankle, and they may either have to go to ICE's facility in Burlington, Mass. Once a week to check in, or they might have ICE come to their house. So I know some people that are under that circumstance right now. It's better than being in detention. However, as you can imagine, it's very stressful because sometimes ICE decides at a certain date, a certain check-in, that they're going to pick that person up and set them off for deportation or put them in detention. So it's better than being in detention. It's still not great. If you are not in detention, but have been picked up by ICE and had removal proceedings started, meaning that you are on the road to deportation, the immigrant is likely to get a court date in the mail. It is extremely important that the individual show up for court. Anyone who misses a court date will be ordered removed from the country in absentia. It's very, very hard to lift an order, removal order that's been entered in the absence of the immigrant. So it's crucial that if somebody has a court date, that they show up and go to court. I know it's people want to run, they want to hide, they don't want to go, but it's very, very important that they go. And everybody's assigned, an immigrant will have an A number. It's called an A number. It's almost like a social security number. They can call this phone number on the screen to find out their status, when their next court date is. You just enter the A number, and the line is available in English and Spanish. This is the reporting I was talking about with ICE going to Burlington. As I said, going to court is crucial. Once somebody has been ordered deported, they really can't, it's very hard to lift it. So it is possible. There are what's called motions to reopen. It can happen in narrow circumstances, but once somebody has a deportation order, it'll stay with them for a very, very long time. There are many immigration attorneys for hire. There are also immigration attorneys that are willing to work for reduced fees, and there are pro bono immigration attorneys. Most people, if they can possibly consult with a lawyer, they absolutely should do that, because immigration law is extremely complicated. There are many different kinds of relief that may be available. If somebody has an immigration lawyer, their chance of success is exponentially higher than if they try to represent themselves. If somebody does represent themselves, or even if they have a lawyer and they speak a foreign language, they should ask the judge for an interpreter in the courtroom. At the end of this presentation, there will be some slides that have information, phone numbers of lawyers that can be called, or organizations that provide legal services. As I said before, there are many possible ways to defend against removal and to try to get immigration relief. So for people that are facing DACA termination, TPS termination, anyone who's here unlawfully who gets picked up by ICE, there are these different ways to try to get immigration relief. One is if a person is a victim of a crime in the US and they report that crime to the police and they help the police, they are cooperative with the police to prosecute the crime, they can get what's called a U visa. Victims of domestic violence can also get relief through what's called VAWA, V-A-W-A. Anybody who is afraid to return to their home countries due to persecution or torture, This is very applicable to individuals who are gay because many countries are extremely anti-gay, may have an asylum claim or a basis to seek what's called withholding of removal or relief under the Convention Against Torture. There's a 1-year application deadline to seek asylum, but those deadlines do not necessarily apply to the other forms of relief, and there are ways to get the bar to the 1-year deadline lifted. If you know anybody who has come to the U.S. within the last year and who may have an asylum claim, please tell them to file their application for asylum within the 1 year. Minors who have been abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both of their parents may be eligible to get what's called special immigrant juvenile status. This applies to many, many children who have come to the U.S. from Central America, kids who are seeking to avoid gang violence in El Salvador or other terrible conditions in Guatemala, Honduras. We represent a lot of kids. It's better if they are under the age of 18. The government's program technically goes through kids who are age 21, but recently the government has started denying petitions for kids who are above 18. So if you know of a child who has an issue, been abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both parents, so they could be with their mother but have a father who abandoned them, and they're under age 18, they may well qualify for special immigrant juvenile status. Trafficking victims may have relief, and green card holders who have a family member or based on employment may be able to get immigration relief. So if they have a parent who is a U.S. citizen, that may help. If they have a child who's a U.S. citizen who's 21, that child can petition for the parent to obtain citizenship. And there are other options, but again, it's all very complicated. There is something called the 10-year law, and many people have been the victims of fraud based on this rule, so we like to call it out. If somebody has been in the U.S. for 10 years or more, they may have a pathway to citizenship. However, that pathway is very narrow. They must be in deportation proceedings, so they could be in detention, and they must show that either a U.S. citizen or a green card holder who's a relative would suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if they are deported. So there is a benefit to people, a potential benefit if they've been here for more than 10 years, but it is not the case that simply being in the U.S. for 10 years or more is a pathway to citizenship. That is something that's been told to people in exchange for money. Like, there are people called notarios publico who have unfortunately fleeced people out of money on the grounds that they could get citizenship for being here more than 10 years. It is simply not the case. So everyone should avoid scams and be on the lookout for these types of scams. Unfortunately, only an attorney or somebody who's called an accredited representative before the Immigration Review Board can provide legal advice. If somebody has a criminal history, they should either get an attorney who specialized in criminal defense work, or make sure their immigration lawyer is familiar with criminal issues. There is a large overlap, especially in detention cases, between people with criminal backgrounds and their immigration status, and it's really crucial for the lawyer to understand both to be an effective attorney. If somebody, anyway, people should attend legal screenings if they can do that, or consult with a lawyer to make sure that there aren't, before they throw in the towel and go back to their home country, they should find out what they may be eligible for. We do see people that feel incredibly defeated. They're in detention. They've been in detention in some cases for 7 months, 8 months, over a year, and they just are ready. They are fed up and they're ready to go back to their country, even though they don't have any family members or friends there. I've just seen many, many unfortunately defeated people. So the best thing we can do is try to get help for those individuals. How they can do that, there are different ways. There are free legal screenings at City Hall in Boston on the first and third Wednesdays of every month from 12 noon to 2 p.m. It's first come, first served. No appointments are necessary or even available. People just have to show up. If they need an interpreter other than Spanish, they should call at least a week in advance to get that interpreter set up for them. The consultations are 15 minutes. But for someone who has no access to a lawyer otherwise, I highly recommend going to City Hall. Boston is a sanctuary city, which means there are not ICE officials roaming the halls of City Hall, and therefore City Hall is a safe place, and people should feel comfortable going into City Hall. So the next screenings are February 7th and 21st. I crossed out the 10th and the 17th of January simply because the time has passed. Here are lists of nonprofit groups that represent immigrants free of charge. Some individuals do, in some of these groups actually, I think have small charges. The PAIR Project does not. That's the group that I work with. We focus on detained cases and asylum for people in immigration detention and people who are not in detention. The PAIR Project phone number is there, and the line is open between 1 and 3 every day during the week. And again, you'll get a copy of these slides, so don't try to frantically write all this down. If somebody is a victim of immigration fraud or the unauthorized practice of law, it should be reported to the Attorney General's office. Hate crimes can be reported to the number on the screen. The ACLU is doing a lot with immigration as well, particularly when constitutional rights are violated. So that's another good resource. And I know I talked an awful lot. I hope you were able to hear me. That's a lot of information, but again, you'll have the slides so you can spend more time with them, and feel free. Happy to talk to anybody individually. You can contact me at the PAIR Project. And I can't see if there are questions, so please let me know if anyone has any questions.
Just looking in the questions box, I don't see anything new, but if anybody does have anything they'd like to ask, you can feel free. I can unmute folks as well. So it doesn't look like it. All right, well, thank you so much, Irene. This was a ton of information. It was really quite helpful. And I'm just meant to be on my final slide here. All right. Great. So thanks everybody for being here. As Irene said, we are going to go ahead and send out the PDF files of the slides and some other resources that you're able to use. And at the same time, we'll remind you of that link to the YouTube video that she said would be quite helpful to take a look at. So you'll have keep an eye on your email. You'll have some resources coming through that you can use and share with your colleagues as well. So then again, thank you so much to Irene and to the PAIR Project for giving us all this great information today. And with any other questions or thoughts anyone has about this webinar today or future training opportunities, you can go ahead and email me at jessbenedetto@masscap.org. Again, I'm Jess Benedetto. I'm MassCap's Training and Resource Manager. And you can also check out what we have coming up at masscap.org. So thank you everyone so much. And today's webinar has also been recorded, so you can keep an eye out for that becoming available again as another resource. Thank you, Irene. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.